Okay, it's 8 o'clock. Shall we start? Dr. Lu Hong and Janet?
Yes. Good evening, Jinzhao. Good evening, Dr. Lu.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, just about to start, 8 o'clock dead-on time. Okay, good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many old friends and some newcomers online every other Sunday at 8 p.m. A very big welcome to everybody for joining us online at another Mandarin Wine Club webinars, which are co-hosted by Cambridge China Center, the Confucius Institute for Business London, and Wine Peak, fortnightly on Sundays, with our wine speaker Jenny Wang, author of the Chinese Wine Renaissance. I'm Jinzhao Li, Director of Cambridge China Center. The topic today is Chinese and Western cultures in a wine glass. Very interesting topic. Janet will talk about, of course, Ganbei culture down the hatch, and also something different, the art of war, Sun Zi Bingfa, the hundreds of schools of philosophers, 百家争鸣, Kung Fu, and Feng Shui, all in wine, and a lot more. All sounds very interesting. I'm very looking forward to that. And all the audience at the moment are muted. We will activate everybody's audio and video at later part of the webinar so we can carry on drinking and chatting and enjoy our time at the webinar. Now let's welcome Jenny Wang. Janet.
Thank you so much, Jinzhao. Good evening, everybody. And welcome again to our Sunday session. So today, we're going to talk about the cultures, Chinese and Western cultures found in a wine glass. So just a reminder of our format, we've been sharing together a mixed case of Chinese wines from 6 boutique wineries from 6 regions in China. So today is quite informal in the sense the wines you drink will not be specified by me this time. So if you still have any wines left from the mixed case, feel free to enjoy that. Or we've launched, last week, we've launched this mixed sparkling case for the festive season. And this is a 3 traditional method sparkling wine, France versus England versus China. So I know some of you have already received this case. So of course you can make a start on one of these as well if you like. So all these wines are available from Cambridge China Center website under the Wine Club section. So if you would like to get the wines, we still have some in stock. So that's the format. And so today, feel free to drink anything you like, and we can have a chat about what you're drinking at the end of the session, and we can talk about the wines, and we can talk about culture. So today, the session is called Chinese and Western Culture in a Wine Glass. So 葡萄美酒中的中西文化. Right, so this is a subject very close to my heart, and actually it is the reason why I got into wine in the first place, because I realized during my time studying and working, actually wine is a great way for us to learn about a place, the people, the food culture, the customs, through a glass of wine, it can really bring people together to try to understand each other's culture. And that is what really attracted me to wine initially. So I want to start with a rather personal story. So when I was very young, as a child, I wasn't really drinking wine, aged, 4 to much later. But my parents taught me a lot of Chinese poetry as a child. And I just recall, even as a child, there were lots of very memorable references to wine in a lot of Chinese literature and poetry. So one thing that really struck me as a young girl was this description of one of the most beautiful women in Chinese history called Lady Yang. So I mentioned her in our very first session, the history session as well. This passage describing her holding a glass studded with treasures and filled with the best grape wine at the time from Liangzhou. And she was singing, she was slightly drunk, but she was singing and dancing. And the emperor saw this beautiful sight in front of him, and he started to play on his jade flute to enjoy the music and the dancing as well. So this scene really made a huge impression on me. And of course, there are lots of Chinese poetry and literature and art, all related to wine culture. So before I was even drinking wine, it was a fascinating subject to me. And then I went to Cambridge, and there was a lot of this going on in Cambridge. So on the left, there's a picture of me and my friends enjoying formal hall at Cambridge. On the right is a picture of St. John's College, decking the hall out for a formal hall. So we had a lot of introduction to wine during university days. And I found I studied computer science. So a lot of my classmates, they're not the most sociable people, let's say, during lecture times. But when we go to formal halls and after a few glasses of wine, everybody's much more sociable. So I really enjoyed those university days when suddenly, wine just made everybody more friendly and chatty. And I learned and I made great friends that way. It wasn't at the lecture halls, but through formal halls when we were drinking and eating, that I made some lifelong friends, right? So again, wine was something that was an important part of our university social scene. And then after I started working, I also started to travel to wine regions. And initially, what made the greatest impression on me were these beautiful properties in Bordeaux with a chateau, very romantic and fairy tale like wineries and vineyards. So it all made a huge impression on me. And I found that actually, wine is something that's not just sociable. It's a great way to discover a region, great holiday options, and it seems quite glamorous. All of this, all of these wine culture related activities, right? And then what really struck me and made me eventually turn to learn about wine in a more serious capacity rather than just a wine drinker was after I met some of these wine producers. And I realized actually what they want to talk about is not how beautiful their chateau was or how expensive the wine was or how great it tastes and, that sort of topic. What they really want to talk about is this stuff, the soil. Almost all of the wine producers I met, the very first thing that get them going or that they would talk about with great passion was the soil, how unique the soil was. And they keep on saying this word, terroir. In France, if you meet French producers, they would always talk about terroir. And I was like, oh, okay, what does this word mean? please tell me what is terroir? And then you get some very vague answers, things like, oh, it's a very elusive cultural term that we have in France, or, oh, it's derived from the French word terre, meaning the earth, but it's so much more than just the earth, or it's a quintessentially French term that does not really translate well into any other language. And they would try to tell you about terroir in terms of the uniqueness of this place, the sense of somewhereness that gets imparted to the wine. So the wine taste of a particular location. It's not just the soil, it's also the climate, it's the terrain, and it's the human touch, etc. All these elusive factors, that make a unique wine that speaks of its place. So after a while, after I had several conversations about terroir with these French producers, what struck me was actually we have a term like that in Chinese, and it's called Feng Tu, right? So I was like, terroir to me means Feng Tu in Chinese. Feng is the Chinese word for wind, and Tu is the word for soil. So wind and soil. It is a term that we use to describe the uniqueness of a location, and it's quite elusive as well. It's not just about soil, it's about all these, all the things about this land that make it special, that gives it a sense of somewhereness. And it could relate to produce, it could relate to the customs or the people, so Feng Tu to me is a translation of terroir. And I said to some of the producers, when you go and promote your wines, don't you find that if you just launch into a discussion about soil type, people might not really immediately make the connection of why this is important? And they said, yes, that is actually true. A lot of the times when they launch into an analysis of the soil, like gravel or limestone, etc., they get some polite smiles and nods, but they can feel that they're not really making the connection. So I suggested, why don't you talk about Feng Tu? Next time, start off your conversation and say, I'm going to tell you about the Feng Tu of my vineyard. And that would probably be a better way to introduce to a new audience in China about how unique your vineyard is. So this sort of conversation really started my wine career, I suppose, trying to draw this connection between culture, between different languages, between these concepts that seems quite difficult to translate, but actually through the language of wine, through the enjoyment and shared experience of wine, suddenly a French winemaker and a Chinese consumer know exactly what they're talking about. Right? They have this sudden shared common knowledge, shared experience while holding a glass of wine. And that to me is magical. That is, for me, what makes wine so special and what makes wine culture so fascinating. And this is sort of the start of my wine writing career, is to trying to find these connections through wine between the Western and the Eastern culture. So connection between terroir and Feng Tu, we can delve a little bit deeper. So what does terroir actually encapsulate? So a wine producer might tell you there are essentially three major elements in terroir. First of all, it's to do with the climate. Right, so the macroclimate of a region, whether it's influenced by the ocean, maritime climate, or is it a landlocked area where there's continental climate? And, in previous talks, we discussed about, in Chinese regions, you sometimes have this eastern monsoon type of climatic influence. So the climate is certainly a major part, right? And also, Climate would be things like, how much rainfall do you get in a year, how much sunshine hours, and the diurnal temperature differences between day and night, and seasonal variations. Are the seasons distinctive? Do you have a long, hot summer, a long ripening period, etc., all that sort of thing, which are very essential to winemaking regions, right? So climate is of utmost importance. And then you have the terrain, factors to do with not just the soil type, whether it's gravelly or sandy or loess plateau. We mentioned in the earlier talk about China's unique terroir. We talked about different soil types, but also terrain would be lay of the land. Is it high altitude? Is it in Xinjiang province, for example, there are areas of depression. There are mountainous regions. There are flatlands, drained by the Yellow River, for example. So terrain is also a major part of this equation. And then you have the human touch. So this is an area where a lot of wine producers would have slightly different interpretations of whether the human touch is important to the terroir. So places where the land is blessed with almost perfect conditions to make wine, usually the winemakers would say they want the wines to make themselves. We have a light touch approach to winemaking. We want the land and the climate to speak for themselves, right? So the touch is very light. Whereas in other regions where the natural conditions are challenging, then potentially you need to do more work in the winery, right, to make the wine pleasant or consistent, for example. So there you would have fairly heavy human touch, human influence on the wine, right? So that is an area where winemakers would have fairly different opinions. And if we look at this definition, broad definition of terroir in these three elements, then I'm sure a lot of the Chinese friends here would immediately make the association with the concept of 天时地利人和, right? So 天时 in Chinese, so 天 here means the sky or the heaven. So 天时 is a concept that we have in China to mean whether heaven favors your endeavor. So the climate, is it favorable? Does the heaven favor you? 地利 is the land. 地 is the land or soil. So 地利 is the condition or the advantage of terrain. Is it suitable, or does it offer you some kind of advantage? And 人和 means 人 is people. So 人和 is the collaboration, endeavor, and wisdom of the humans, right? And 天时地利人和 are terms that we have in very famously from the war strategies, the art of war, and promoted by Sun Wu and Sun Bing, two of the most famous Chinese war strategists. And they both mentioned these three very important factors. And 天时地利人和 is a concept that is almost applied in China, in all sorts of situations, right? It originated from the war strategies during the spring and autumn period. But in essence, we now apply these three concepts very widely in everyday life, in business. Some people even say you need 天时地利人和 even in a relationship, right? So it's a very widely applied principle. So very famously, 天时地利人和 三者不得虽胜有殃, which means the will of the heavens, the advantage of the land, and the collaboration of the people. All these three elements are essential. If one is missing, even if you are okay in the short term, you can be sure that there will be problems later, right? So all these three elements are essential. And that is certainly true in winemaking, because a lot of the times what determines whether a vintage is successful, you need good weather conditions throughout the year, right? Sometimes a spring hail or a spring frost or hail could destroy, the flowering of the vines, and that would have repercussions later on. Or sometimes the conditions are perfect through spring and summer, but then you have rain just before harvest, then the grapes would not be as concentrated as you would like. The flavors would be slightly diluted, etc. So the climatic condition is important throughout the year. And the terrain, of course, if you have a drought or rainfall, and the soil means that you have water stress, too much water stress, for example, then again, you would have a difficult vintage. And then the human touch, if you've over extracted in the winery, etc., then perhaps the wine would not be as ideal as you'd like to be. So all these three elements are important at every stage. You have to make the right decisions to ensure that a vintage can be at its best. So I just put a book reference as well in my book, where I talk about this subject in greater detail, which you can refer to later. And of course, as we're talking about the art of war, we also know that wine has been used throughout Chinese history as ways to motivate soldiers. For example, so we mentioned this poem a few weeks ago that mentions grape wine being sent to the frontiers to motivate us. Frontier soldiers, to comfort them and make them keep them brave, right? And we also know throughout history, throughout Chinese history, wine are often used to as gestures of diplomatic goodwill, for example, or occasionally it's used to bribe senior officials. So a few weeks ago, we also mentioned that grape wine in particular commanded a very high price. So in the Han Dynasty, someone was able to bribe an official with equivalent to 26 bottles of grape wine in exchange for a ministerial post in a state the size of New Zealand. So 26 bottles of wine for the state of New Zealand is quite a good deal, really, in today's terms. But, wine was used in a lot of these political intrigues and in warfare, in diplomatic gesturing, etc. So wine and war have always gone hand in hand, and in terms of wine and strategies as well. So we talked about Feng Tu being similar to the concept of terroir. And of course, we also have the term Feng Shui, right? Feng Shui is probably more well known to our Western friends. Yeah, Feng Shui. So Feng Shui, Feng again, wind, Shui means water. So wind and water. And we can understand Feng Shui in terms of the mesoclimates and the microclimate of a vineyard. So what do we mean by that? So we talked about climate in a terroir sort of macro terms is about a region, whether the climate is continental or maritime, what's the sunshine hour, average sunshine hour of the year, etc. That sort of macro climate that impacts the terroir. But when we talk about specific vineyards, right, so that is influenced by mesoclimate, or if we're talking about even deeper into the vineyard, a row of vine or an individual vine, what that is impacted by is the very specific site climate, which is the microclimate. So in this picture, you can see even within one vineyard, depending on, for example, the orientation, if the slope is facing south or north, you'll be getting different amount of sunshine during the day, right? And also within the vineyard, if the vines are on the top of the hill versus the bottom of the hill, again, you might be getting different sunshine, but also the temperature difference could be fairly great sometimes. And you could have a situation where on the top of the hill, you get this morning mist or dew, a lot more moisture. Versus the vines at the bottom of the hill. Things like that, right? Things like that would impact the character of the wine, actually, at the end of the day, right? So this is very prominent in a lot of the terroir-driven wine-producing regions, most notably perhaps Burgundy, right? In Burgundy, you have like very specific tiny parcels. The winemakers there would go to great pain to separate parcels in terms of their microclimate, because they know the resulting wine would display very different characters. And this is something that we can understand or to explain the concept of feng shui. So feng shui to a lot of Chinese people is in essence about the energy flow, about orientation and aspects. So if we Chinese people, when they go and buy a house, for example, they would almost always want to know the aspect, right? Does the bedroom, which aspect, what's the ideal aspect for the bedroom versus the living room, that sort of thing. And it's something that most Chinese people would consider when they go and buy a house, right? So feng shui, without going into very technical details, in essence, is all about using directions, orientations, aspects, how the air circulates in a space, and what that would affect in terms of our living habit, of our well-being, the flow of energy or the gathering of energy, and that sort of concepts, right? So aspects and orientation on your well-being, is the essence of what feng shui is about, right? So again, for wine lovers, this is a really interesting way to understand the principles of feng shui, right? And drawing parallels in how a vineyard is managed, or how why a wine would taste so different from very slightly different parcels of land, right? And so this is a good way for us to understand these concepts. So now we talked about terroir and microclimate in Chinese, in a way that the Chinese can understand. So now we can do the reverse and try to explain a rather elusive term in Chinese in wine term. So for example, qi. Qi is something that we hear a lot, right? Qi in Mandarin. But what exactly is qi? So qi is, again, one of those terms, a bit like terroir, that a lot of Chinese people will say, well, it's quite an elusive term. It doesn't translate terribly well from Chinese to another language because it's so broad. It's encapsulates a lot of concepts. So it could mean quite simply air, right? 空气 means air. 氧气 means oxygen. But actually, we all know, Chinese people all know, actually, qi is so much more than that. It's part of our philosophical construct. It's also a concept that's at the very essence of Chinese medicine, Chinese traditional medicine. So we have terms like 元气, which is kind of like the elemental qi. So what is the elemental qi, right? We have concepts like 气数. 气数, shu is counting or volume or number. So what is qi number? How do you translate qi number to our Western friends? How do you explain it? And we have things like 采气. 采气 literally means gathering qi. So what does it mean by gathering qi, right? These are fairly complex terminologies in Chinese to A, translate, and B, try to explain to a Western audience. But again, luckily, I feel that if we're talking about wine, we have a good way of explaining what these concepts mean. So let us try to understand these three terms with a glass of wine in hand and pretend that we want to understand the ageability, the concept of ageability of wine. What does it mean for a wine to age, right? Why does a wine age and why is it interesting in a wine? So for us, a wine, the aging potential or the ageability of a wine is really to do with its elemental qi, right? So its energy force. So we sometimes say, oh, this wine is fresh and alive, and it's very lively. It's got a lot of vitality to it, right? So that is the fundamental element of whether a wine is good or not. You know, is it energetic? Does it have vitality? And does it have vitality that seems to be able to elongate this wine's life, right? So that's at the heart of the ageability question of wine. And we can understand 元气, so the elemental qi. You know, qi, if in this sense we understand it as an energy source or a life source, right? So going back to the foundations of Chinese philosophy, qi is the elemental energy and life force in any living being, right? So 元气 elemental force is the vitality of a wine, right? And then we can talk about 采气, which is this concept of gathering energy, right? So we sometimes we talk about how a wine evolves over time. So what's the point of aging wine? And that is because wine over time, you know, the interactions between the tannins, the acidities, the sugars, the alcohol, they somehow integrate over time and become more harmonious and resolved. And that is when the wine is at its peak, you know, at its best. So a lot of wines are not easy to drink when they're young, right? A lot of the best ageable wines are quite austere, you know, quite unresolved when they are young. But over time, with the interaction of oxygen, with the interaction between the elements in the wine, they become resolved and harmonious and balanced. And perhaps 10, 20, 30 years later, after bottle aging, they become they become their best. Right. So this is the concept of 采气 in Chinese, which means gathering energy. Right. So you're gathering energy from the air. You know, this interaction with oxygen, for example, or in Chinese traditional Chinese medicine, we say 采气when we do kung fu or when we do some kind of meditation or exercising. We are trying to be one with the universe and gathering energy forces, positive energy forces from the environment, from the universe. So that is 采气in Chinese. right? So it's this concept of capturing the essence from the universe, right? So, and that is in the wine aging analogy would be when the wine is trying to resolve itself and trying to interact with other elements in order to become its best. And then we have this concept of qi shu. Qi shu is the count of qi, the volume, i.e., if you say something has come to the end of its qi shu, i.e., come to the end of its lifespan or its life potential, then this living being would be on the decline or would be at the end of its life, right? So again, with wine, we have this concept of a wine peaking and then going into decline. So the wine also has a lifespan, an aging potential, and a qi shu, right, in Chinese, right? And this lifespan and potential is partly determined at birth, i.e., there's an element of fatalism in this concept of qi shu, but also there's an element of self-determination, right? So, like potential, it's partly tied to the destiny or the concept of fate, but also a part of it is based around how you live your life. With wine, it's the same. Wine has potential because, for example, the vine itself in the vineyard, it has a certain lifespan that's given as a predetermined factor in the wine, but also based on how the wine is made in the winery, that would also determine the ageability of the lifespan or the aging potential of the wine, right? So these three concepts, which are I think quite difficult to explain, can be understood when we're talking about the life cycle of a bottle of good wine as well. And that, to me, is quite interesting. And of course, if we talk about qi, another Chinese concept, which is part of the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity, is this concept of 节气. 节气 is 24 solar terms. So 24节气 means 24 solar terms. So we have a calendar system that's most useful for in the fields of agriculture and also health, well-being. We tend to break up the year and the seasons into 24 small solar terms based on the phase of the sun. And this has, in recent years, received a bit of a revival in both in Chinese agricultural practices and also in terms of well-being. A lot of people are now choosing their food, how to cook their food and what sort of things to eat based on this concept of seasonality around these 24 intervals. So this is a very interesting area in even in viticulture in China. Several wineries are encapsulating this 24 solar terms concept in their vineyard management, right? So rather saying, certain things happen in spring, actually using the 24 intervals, you can be much more precise about when things are done, right? And also because these 24 intervals change a little bit year from year. So you can pinpoint specific activities to something that is much more in phase with that particular year, in phase with nature. So this is a very interesting area of viticulture that is quite unique to China. So now we're gonna move on to more philosophical discussion. So if we talk about qi, so as I was mentioning, qi in China is a term that is deeply ingrained in our philosophical construct. So for example, in Taoism, Taoism, qi is the essence of being, right? Qi is the essence of life, of the universe, of harmony, and we have this concept of 百家争鸣. 百家争鸣 literally means 100 schools of contention, which was a period where philosophical thoughts in China flourished, and different schools of thinking would debate about certain subjects, and often it is done in a symposium format, very much similar to the famous Greek symposiums that were happening almost around the same time, first millennia BC. Lots of different philosophical thoughts were being discussed and forging and reforming and evolving at the time. So Taoists in particular have an affinity with wine. So they believe wine is the wondrous thing between heaven and earth, and it's almost how humans can attain enlightenment and reach a higher plane of consciousness and understanding through the art of inebriation. So inebriation for them is a desirable state, because in that stage you are at your most natural, most free, right? So it's almost an art to be inebriated. And throughout Chinese history, we have this influence. You can see this influence especially among artists and scholars. A lot of artists and poets and calligraphers and painters would produce their best work under the influence of alcohol. And often in times of trouble, a lot of scholars would retreat and to have a almost hermit type of existence. And they would sort of retreat into this state of sort of perpetual drunkenness in order to escape the worldly realm and to enter a higher realm of creativity. So Taoism has a very strong affinity with wine culture in China. And the other school that has a great influence on the Chinese wine culture even to this day is the Confucian school. So Confucius himself was more interested in the decorum and the ritualistic aspect of wine. So unlike the Taoist school, where wine drinking is very much a way to enter a state of mind, and it's free and unbridled. For the Confucian school, wine drinking is much more ritualistic. And wine, according to the Confucian school, first and foremost, is used to pay respect. So you pay respect with wine to heaven, to ancestors, to gods, and then you pay respect to elders, seniors, right, before you would actually drink. So here I just quote something that I find quite interesting. So even to this day, often if you go to attend a Chinese banquet, you'll notice we still have this habit of toasting. And usually we toast 3 times, or we toast 3 rounds, right? So this 3 seems to be a magic number around the Chinese banqueting and toasting ceremony, right? And we still do it to this day. And why is that? Because we have this concept that came from the Confucian school, that 3 is a gesture, is a number of gestures. So when a gentleman drinks, the first cup, he pays respect. The second cup, he remains decorous. And the third cup, he is joyful. And after that, he should just stop before things get out of hand. Right? So we have this concept of 3 as gentlemanly behavior. But actually, Confucius himself said wine drinking doesn't really have a limit on as long as you remain decorous, i.e. you don't lose form, right? So before you lose form, you should stop. And to make this rule a bit simpler, subsequently, the Confucian school formed this rule of 3. And quite interestingly, the very obvious parallel to draw between this 100 school of contention that's happening in China would be the Greek philosophers and the symposiums that were happening roughly around the same time, right? So this is very interesting, which kind of echoes what we just read from the Confucian school, which basically says, for sensible men, I prepare only 3 craters. So craters is this wine container type of thing you can see on the bottom right corner here. That's an example of a crater. So crater is used for mixing wine with water. So this is not necessarily full strength wine, So again, 3 here is really just a symbol to indicate some kind of decorum, right? So 3 craters, 1 for health, the second for love and pleasure, and the third for sleep. So after the third, wise men go home. So this, has great echo to what the Confucian school was saying. And I thought this is a very interesting parallel for us to draw on. So now I want to slightly talk about what does that mean for wines of China as a new emerging wine region? Why are we talking about these cultural references and parallels and comparisons? And I think this is a great opportunity for the Chinese wine industry because to date, what we have seen is that China initially was almost operating in stealth mode. So I'm talking about the modern Chinese wine industry of the last 30 to 50 years, right? So the first part, Chinese wine industry was almost operating under some kind of stealth mode. They were trying to experiment with varieties and just to make some wine that is of decent quality. And then the second phase, they've started to produce wines of good technical ability and quality, but they were trying to copy the styles of old world regions such as Bordeaux. A Bordeaux blend is almost the holy grail of any Chinese winery. Any serious winemakers want to first prove that they can make a good Bordeaux blend, right? So that's the second phase. But now I think we're moving on to the third phase. And this is when Chinese wines are starting to make appearances on the international stage, whereby it's trying to show something of its own character. It's trying to show its own terroir, its own Feng Tu. So for example, Chinese wines now hold annual Feng Tu symposiums, right? They have these conferences based around the subject of Feng Tu. So each region would want to showcase their Feng Tu and what that terroir impart on various grape varieties. So they want to start to show geographical characters. And also Chinese wine regions are starting to use the appellation idea. So we have in Ningxia Helan Mountain appellation, for example. So this is a great opportunity to show for Chinese wineries to show what China is about as a new wine region. And the second opportunities, I think, are to do with this concept of introducing our own system of agricultural calendar, right? So Chinese agriculture calendar have always been based on this 24 solar terms type of ways of dividing up the seasons. And we also have a lunar-based calendar, which is the traditional agricultural calendar. And of course, this has great affinity with the recent biodynamic movement in viticulture, right? So biodynamic practices in China, for example, here we have a picture of Emma Gao, the winemaker at Silver Heights Vineyard in Ningxia. So they are one of the pioneers in biodynamic practices, viticulture in China, right? But she's not doing it just in the European way of understanding what biodynamic practices means, right? She's also incorporating traditional Chinese concepts, traditional Chinese agriculture, and traditional ways of maintaining well-being, the human as one with nature, with the land, with the vineyard, with the wine, etc. So this is very interesting as an area where Chinese winemakers can bring something of their own to the world of viticulture and winemaking, right? So I think this is very exciting, and which is why I want to end on the concept of Kung Fu. What is actually Kung Fu? So when we talk about Kung Fu in the West, people tend to think about martial arts, like fighting, fist fighting, or some kind of Tai Chi type of ways of self-defense or exercising or that sort of thing. But actually, Kung Fu in Chinese is a much wider term that encapsulates not just the martial arts element, but anything that's done with a lot of effort. Kung Fu is something that we invest a lot of our time and energy and studies over time to refine, to become the best in a certain field. So we sometimes talk about, Kung Fu in cooking. We could be making a soup with applying a lot of Kung Fu to soup because you want to make sure the soup, the temperature, the ingredients, everything is done to perfection. And we tell children to apply Kung Fu when they're studying, meaning, you have to apply a lot of energy and effort to become good at something. So we say 下功夫 to children, right? To say apply 功夫 when you're studying. So 功夫 is actually not just about martial art. It's a concept that we have to be always striving to improve oneself. It's a lifelong learning process through studying, through experience, through practices to refine an area of expertise. Right? So I think this is an opportunity for Chinese wines, to move from stealth mode to copying mode to now trying to apply its own Kung Fu to its viticulture and winemaking practices, and hopefully in the future showcasing something rather unique of its own to the wider world. And I think that is where Chinese wines can really become very interesting to the international community of wine lovers in the future. So I will leave it there, and also just to mention my book. So as you have seen, I've put some book references to some of these topics that we discussed today, and there are more in the book. So the Chinese Wine Renaissance is really not just about wine, but really to tie in all these cultural concepts to give you a flavor of the history and customs of China through thousands of years of civilization told through a wine perspective. And as I was saying at the beginning, this is really what got me interested and into wine and into wine writing. So I hope this book is something that could give you a flavor of Chinese history, customs, philosophy, and how Chinese people think and behave, etc., but all told through a wine narrative, which is a bit more fun, right? So, so I mentioned this because, it's nearly Christmas, and in case you are short on Christmas gift ideas, this could be something to consider for someone who likes wine or likes history or are interested in China, for example. So, okay, next week, not next week, but 20th of December, which is in 2 weeks' time, we're going to wrap up our current season with a festive sparkling wine special. So we have one Chinese sparkling wine in that mixed case that you've seen, but also we're going to pitch it against an English sparkling wine and a French champagne, right? So the idea being the incumbent sort of everybody's favorite is the French champagne. But how about a English sparkling wine made in the traditional champagne method versus a Chinese sparkling wine made also in the traditional method? And this Chinese wine is made for the 2008 Olympics, actually. So it's a vintage sparkling wine made in 2006 for the occasion of the Beijing Olympics. So it's rather special as well for that reason. So I'll just remind you that feel free to get the case and crack open any one of them next time we talk, or maybe all three if you are watching with friends, and then we can have a discussion about which one is your favorite and that sort of thing. So that's for next time, and you can find out more of these details on the Cambridge China Center website under the Wine Club page. Okay, so while I'm here, I'll also mention that this year and hopefully next year, one of the projects that I am working on is a Chinese wine renaissance documentary. Again, trying to tie in all these cultural concepts and also what we've been exploring over the last 5 sessions, in each wine regions of China, and look at the wine regions, but also the culture, the food culture, the local customs, so that you have a greater understanding of China through the discussion of wine. So that's the project I'm hoping to work on next year. And I do welcome anybody with who might have ideas or contacts. So we're at the stage where we're looking for funding from various sources. So we're open to all sorts of discussions at the moment from official or maybe private sources of financing. So we're considering different options. So if you are interested in this project or have contacts and connections or ideas, do drop me a line, and I'll be very glad to discuss this project as well with you. Okay, so I'll leave it there for now, and we can open up to enjoy some of the wines, whatever you might be drinking today, and have a chat, and I'll take any questions and comments. So thank you all. I'll stop sharing the screen so we can see everyone. Okay, I'll pass it back to Jingzhao or Dr. Lu to make any announcements, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Janet. Thank you. Lots of very interesting concepts. Some are quite difficult to understand for some of our Western friends, like Qi and Feng Shui. Some others are very hilarious, like when is appropriate to retreat, if we can. Actually, we have Dr. Lu Hong here. Dr. Lu Hong is the Executive Director of Confucius Institute for Business, London. Shall we have welcome Dr. Lu Hong to say a few words about Chinese culture, particularly in wine, if she is around.
To be honestly, I feel sorry.
Dr. Lu, you're muted again.
Sorry. So I'm just trying to get myself. It looks like I cannot open my camera. So okay, never mind. I'm not good at wine because when I look at wine, I look at the bottle. If the bottle is beautiful, I will buy it. However, I'm lucky to have two friends. One is Jonathan Gladder, who loves wine, and also another friend who is called Martin Barrows. He is also the old friend because he told me when he started his first job in Hong Kong, his job is to sell wine. So I believe I have these two friends can help me to share the wine culture while they are working with China. So, Johnny, will you be able to help? And Martin, I believe you can help as well because you are all experts.
Great. Well, welcome. First of all, welcome our new guests and new friends to join this session. I'm always very happy when Dr. Lu Hong, bringing new friends and just seeing new faces. So
Martin, you're there. Please tell me your story. Yes.
Would you like me to say a few words?
Yes, please, because I can see you dressed in Chinese and then share your wine experience. You are the first person who actually sell the British wine to China in Hong Kong.
That's right. Well, ni hao, nice to see you all. And it's true, in 1965, my first job in Hong Kong was selling wine. And wine was unheard of in Hong Kong in those days. In restaurants, people only drank beer or whiskey, Mau Tai. There was no wine as we know it today. Of course, there was in some of the top hotels, but everything else, it was very new. And I was going around all these places, showing them about wine and giving them samples to try and so on and so forth. Of course, China hadn't opened up at that stage. There was a very limited market there and in other parts of East Asia. But, gradually, of course, it took off. And, been incredible the way it's developed ever since then across the whole region. So it's a very exciting future. And, of course, British wine was unheard of in those days. Nowadays, some wine from Hampshire is winning prizes, making the French rather jealous. And, of course, in China itself, too. Of course, I love Mau Tai, but I'm very happy to have more traditional wine as well. So that's it. The key thing when you drink Mau Tai is not to mix it with any other spirit, any other drink. Then you don't have a big hangover. But if you have too much of it and mix it, then you're in serious trouble the next day. But anyway, it's all great products. And so you've made fantastic progress in China. And good luck for the future. I'm sorry, I have to leave now to another meeting, but I just wanted to say that, Janet, and good luck. And I look forward to reading your book. And let's perhaps Hongmu can put us in email contact and we can have some follow-up.
Yes. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Johnny has been living in China for more than 10 years. And I believe while you're doing your promotion or develop the business for the Grand Thornton, I believe the wine will definitely play a very important role in the business. Yeah, Johnny, would you like to share some of the experience with us?
Well, it's very kind of you to invite me this evening, and I have actually already tried one of the wines, which was the English wine, the Tickle, which was extremely good. So I'm looking forward to trying the Chinese wine later on this week. But to Professor Liu's point of view, I spent 10 years in China. You can see that now I'm not in China. I'm actually behind me is the Institute of Directors in the United Kingdom. So I'm the Director General of the Institute of Directors in the UK. But I spent 10 years working in China, and I'm sure it was really interesting to hear your presentation, Janet. Really interesting and inspiring, I think, in terms of the connection between the cultural aspect and the linguistic aspect of Chinese and the culture of wine. And certainly my experience was that, of course, in business, wine and alcohol plays a very large part in developing guanxi in the ships in China, and it has done for centuries. And as you pointed out, the history of China is speckled with key incidents that relate to wine, and often, as you mentioned, it would be used as a mechanism of political manipulation. And sometimes, of course, as we read in many of the Chinese classics, it was used as a mechanism for drawing in the enemy and then killing them when they were drunk. So, well, what a way to go! But nevertheless, part of the structure of warfare in the warring states and other times. So yes, it's a critical element of business is the ability to be able to gambei and to be able to remain clear and good thinking throughout your period. And of course, the next morning you have to get up at 8 o'clock and go and negotiate. And I've always respected the Chinese ability to drink until they literally can't stand up in the evening and then negotiate hard with me in the morning. So it's a great talent. But I would also echo the comment that was being made by the other contributor, that China is changing and the emergence of such great wines from China, as we're starting to see, as the one you've identified, really gives rise to people need to take notice. It's not just in wine that China is becoming into the ascendancy. And I think it's really good that we're now seeing, despite the political difficulties, we're now seeing more and more of the British political community starting to look towards China as an opportunity. We certainly are at the Institute of Directors. So thank you very much for letting me speak, and thank you for having me today. Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you.
Everyone is welcome to contribute because you definitely have your personal experience in terms of enjoying the wine, different kind of wine, and also thinking about the business you have done or you are going to be involved. So that is going to be an interesting, enjoyable Sunday night. Relaxed, enjoyable, but sharing. When the lockdown is over, we can definitely meet in person somewhere in Cambridge in Jin Zhao's restaurant.
Can I say something?
Hi,
Janet.
Yeah.
I prepared a question today for you.
Yeah.
So when you those poems you quoted, like the Liangzhou Chi, mentioned the 葡萄酒, which is surprised me. I mean, because it takes years for me to understand actually why this word in Chinese. Those lot of poems you mentioned. Apart from that one, actually the wine means the spirit. So not necessarily is the 葡萄酒, the grape.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. So the very first session we did back in July, so we started with a discussion about the word wine. In English or European language, when we talk about wine, we normally means wine made from grape juice, right? Fermented grape juice. Whereas the word 酒 in Chinese can mean any type of alcoholic beverages, right? So, but we do that sort of translation because both the word 酒 and the word wine have a greater sort of cultural cachet attached to it, right? So if you said 酒精 or something, it just doesn't quite work, 酒精 and alcohol doesn't quite have that cultural connotation as wine or the word 酒. So in Chinese, when we talk about 酒, yes, it could be rice wine, it could be spirits. But actually, if you look at the literature of grape wine in China, so grape wine came to China. The first record was in Shi Ji, which was talking about how wine came through the Silk Road in the 2nd century BC to China. And then, that 凉州词, for example, is very specifically talking about 葡萄酒, which means grape wine. And then you have also other wine poems in Chinese that sometimes talk about the color. So when they talk about like green or something, actually that is referring to grape wine. So if you read some of Li Bai's poem, for example, he would be talking about the color of this wine is green, light green, like emerald, or like the color of the river, which is green at that time. So when they're talking about that sort of color reference, you also know they're talking about a type of grape wine. And similarly, the first preface I showed you about Lady Yang dancing with a glass of grape wine from Liangzhou. Again, that's referring to grape wine. The thing with grape wine is that it was very expensive. So during the Han Dynasty, up until the Tang Dynasty, it was really only enjoyed by the upper classes and royalty, right? By the Tang Dynasty, it became something much more widely available. So you have a lot of Tang Dynasty poets. They're not royalty, but they will be enjoying grape wine and they write about it. And also during Tang Dynasty, you probably know in the metropolis of Chang'an, Xi'an, which is the capital, you had a lot of foreign traders coming through to Xi'an to sell wine. So the reference to 胡人 meaning foreigner. So 胡人, when they say 胡人古酒, they are foreigners selling wine, and the wine they sell will be grape wine. So these references, they're quite subtle. They're not very obvious from just reading, because they don't necessarily say grape wine like 葡萄酒. But when they are making color references, or when they're talking about a certain type of foreigners who travel through the Silk Road to sell wine or have set up shops, there are lots of Tang poems about foreign girls, young foreign ladies, exotic ladies selling wine in taverns. That wine will be referring to grape wine. Yeah, so it's very interesting. It's quite subtle. So throughout different dynasties, you find different references. And then Su Shi in Song Dynasty, again, wrote about the minister of Taiyuan sending him grape wine. And then Marco Polo then later wrote about grape wine when he visited Beijing, met Kubla Khan. So throughout different dynasties, you keep on coming back to various references to grape wine in particular. Yeah.
Okay. And then following a very interesting question now. So many. You just mentioned the grape wines has been produced in the history of China, but I would say it's not as popular as this wine in the West, because more like Maotai or Wuliangyi, or those wines are the mainstream in China culture. So why the grape wines are not didn't bloom?
So we have to put things in a historical perspective, because from our own lifetimes observation, we only observe what we know. So in the last several hundred years, so let's say from the Yuan Dynasty, when distillation became more popular and prevalent, you'll notice, Maotai, Wuliangye, etc., they probably have sort of between 500 to 600 years of history, the really old brands of Baijiu, for example. Because that came in with the distillation technique, and from that point on, especially after the Mongol Yuan dynasty, wine drinking became much more aggressive. Before then, you don't really see that type of aggressive drinking of very highly alcoholic beverages. So our experience of wine culture, I suppose, is sort of the slightly later experience when the repertoire of alcoholic beverages have expanded hugely, right? But what I find fascinating about grape wine is that, because we are seeing a very interesting renaissance of grape wine in China, right? And to a lot of us, we often think that actually grape wine is very new to China, maybe only 30 years, has only 30 years history. A lot of Chinese people don't realize that we have a very old grape wine history in China, right? So it's interesting because it's a new, almost a new product that's getting a revival. And what's the other interesting aspect for me in particular is grape wine is something that our Western friends could appreciate, right? Because that's something they're familiar with. China in a way is making something that they know, they are familiar with, and they do very well, right? So it's easier to talk about grape wine in the international context. Whereas if I was to introduce the culture of baijiu, baijiu is something that is not widely accepted as a the taste profile can be very difficult for a lot of people because it's quite fiery, it's piercing, and some people don't find it pleasant. So baijiu, a conversation, a cultural discussion around baijiu, at the moment is a bit more difficult, right? Whereas with grape wine, because especially in the UK is a market where the UK consumers, are very sophisticated wine drinkers, and they have had the experience of many wine regions. So with the rise of China as a new wine region, this is interesting for the wine consumers as a new region to discover, a little bit like South Africa, Australia, or New Zealand, that sort of thing, right? Because this market is one that has traditionally put other world regions on the map, right? So the UK market put Bordeaux on the map, put Napa Valley on the map. So could it be also the region that will eventually find interest in Chinese wines, right? So it's interesting from that perspective as well. And, a cultural discussion around grape wine is just an easier starting point than, for example, baijiu, in the international context. Yeah.
We are all drinking different wines today. I'm drinking the red from Beijing Bolongbao. I know somebody in the audience, Tony Hooley, is drinking champagne because it's his birthday today.
Oh, right.
To Tony. Happy birthday.
Tony, well, I'm drinking sparkling as well.
Thank you.
Happy birthday. It's lovely to see Huan Jane again from Portugal. And hello, Huan Jane. And Trevor from Cheshire. And Martin from Sussex. And Robert from London. Is that right?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah. Hi, Janet. Yeah.
Really nice to meet you.
Hey.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're drinking different things. Is that 72 degrees, Trevor?
Yes. Trevor, I can understand where we went wrong. When it said only 3 glasses, it didn't measure the size of the glass.
This was exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
I'm just on my 3rd one now.
All right, yeah. It's time to retreat.
Yeah, time to retreat.
I can recognize there's the rice wine. Rice wine is at 53 or 72 degrees.
72.
Oh, 72.
Oh my gosh.
From Kejia area.
All right.
I use it to flambe the pancakes.
Yeah.
It's the same colour as your cheeks, Trevor.
that Trevor is looking forward to a free choice drinking day. And Hugh and Jane, when they talk about one or two or three, they talk about barrels, not glass. So you can go to bed after 3 barrels.
Units, but the units is variable.
Janet, hello. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Hi.
Lovely to see you. If anybody's interested, my virtual background is the smoking room at the Oxford and Cambridge Club, which is where I think Janet and I last spoke some ago now, unfortunately. But
Oxford and Cambridge
we'll be
Club.
back there again, I hope.
Yeah.
I've ordered the wines, by the way. I haven't tried anything yet. I've got them to drink over Christmas, I think. But I'm looking forward to it. I'll open the sparkling one probably on the 20th to try out our sparkling tasting. My question really is just wondering, given the styles that a lot of the Chinese wines are imitating the sort of French styles, the Bordeaux styles, I mean, how much, if one tours around China, are people trying to make their Chinese grape wine to match the sort of local cuisine and things? I know you've spoken about this before. Because I'm thinking if one goes around Europe, for example, you wouldn't go to Sicily and order a bottle of Bordeaux. You'd go to Sicily and drink the local wine with the local food. Now, if one goes to China, is one going to find that? Are they going down that route? Or is
they are going down that route, but it's not so commercially available yet. So, for example, in your case, there's one which is made from the Longyan dragon eye grape.
Yes.
One of the white wines. So.
Yes.
Actually, that's Vitis vinifera, but it's been growing in China for 800 years, and it's kind of lost to Europe. So it's a bit of a special varietal in China now. But also there are domestic. So the Jinpu, the big sort of the grape family, the Vitis family, actually. Over half of the world's varieties are in China, as wild grapes. They're just called Chinese wild grapes. So over the last 50 to 60 years or so, there have been a lot of effort to either to try them as single varietals, like local Chinese varietals, or there have been lots of breeding programs to find to make new varieties, so crossbreeding between a Chinese grape that is winter hardy, for example, called the Amur grape. So in the north, when the temperature goes down to below minus 20 or something, they want to discover grapes that can survive the winter coldness. Right, so they would cross that with a European wine grape variety, like Muscat, for example. So the idea is to combine this winter hardy quality of the Chinese grape with the aromatic profile of a well-known European wine grape. So there's been a lot of this going on. But the wines are tend at the moment, at least, tend to be very small production, and they are not easy to find commercially. But you can imagine in 5 to 10 years' time, they will start to come online as they become more commercially viable for the vineyards, and also as the vines mature a little bit, because a lot of these are sort of in experimental plots right now, right? So if they do well, you can imagine more vineyards will start planting them. And as the vines mature, they will start to produce commercially available wines. So it's a time thing, yeah. So I think that's one thing to watch out for.
Would we find that the wines are then going to match local food, as presumably it takes hundreds of years to do that, perhaps in Europe?
Yeah.
People would grow the wine and said that the food that might develop to match the wine as well.
Yeah.
Because in lots of places in Europe, you would find that. Obviously, it'd be unusual to find a local wine that was horrible with the local food. So if you've got seafood, you'd have crisp white wines going there to match it, and it would just evolve over time.
Absolutely. There's always an affinity with local wines and local food. It's sort of a joke, but there's a lot of truth in it, which is when in doubt, just drink the local wine. If you don't know how to match your dish. You know, if you're eating in a foreign country and you don't know what wine to pick, just pick the local one.
I think that's what I'm wondering. If you go to China and you pick the local wine, will it go with the local?
Not yet. Not
yet. There are with Chinese food because it is so eclectic in flavours all the time. The banquets tend to be eclectic with sweet and sour and everything in a way that perhaps in European cuisine you don't have.
Yeah.
You've got a big roast beef. If you can have your claret with it, or your burgundy, quite happily.
I mean, Chinese food and wine matching is still quite tricky because the way we eat, right? You have so many different flavors. So simultaneously, it's not one dish course.
I guess that's really good news. Just means we've got to keep trying, doesn't it? Really.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's an interesting area for sure.
Thank you. Yes, thanks.
Maybe choosing Chinese spirits to go with the Chinese food.
Yeah.
That's what local people do.
A lot of people drink spirit, grain liquor or beer, you know, with Chinese food. Mm.
How are you?
Hey.
Oh,
hi, Janet.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. This is Xu Ping. Hi. Yeah. Can I talk something? Can I join you? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hear you? Yes, we can.
Yeah. You know, I really enjoy your presentation and your fun. That's why every time I just join you and I enjoy. You know, I have got a different, very minor issue want to discuss with you. Maybe different from everybody else, and I wish you do not mind. But I really enjoy that. Very inspiring, and I see you are very friendly. So I just want to say something. Just now you mentioned that about 3 times, 3 rounds of drinking the wine, and then after 3rd time, and they retreated. Yeah, it means finish. Yeah, first one for respectful, second one for decorous. How to pronounce? Decorous, yeah, and then 3rd one just say retreat, right? Okay, and also you also might also give us another picture about that invest, yeah. But from my of course, because of my limited perspective, I wish you do not mind. But from my knowledge and my understanding and what I learned before, but I haven't done further research, right? And in Chinese, we often say 酒过三巡 means after 3rd round, we come to talk business.
Yes.
So I'm thinking whether we should develop a little bit in the culture aspect.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And actually, we all know this doesn't really hold up in reality, right? So we have a lot of I think the main point is to notice with interest this concept of 3, you know, because all these sayings that we have, you know, we have various sayings. So one saying is 酒过三巡无长幼 or something, which means after 3 rounds everybody's equal, there's no hierarchy, we can all just loosen up.
Yeah, you know, 酒过三巡, I'm sorry to interrupt, 酒过三巡 means after the 3rd round, but actually it doesn't mean really exact, second and the 3rd, not exactly, but usually, and it means now after that, I come to talk business, means now, and on the other hand, also as you said, very flexible. Yeah, people become friendly, very flexible, and not limited to some how to say the rights or something, right?
Yeah, I mean the concept, the interesting concept is even today we still see a lot of the times we do 3 toasts, you know, or 3 rounds of toast. You know, that is quite interesting. That's a cultural heritage from, you know, the Confucian philosophical school. And that you can see not just in China, but in quite a lot of Asian cultures, you know, this concept of 3 toasts, one to symbolize heaven, one to symbolize earth, or one to symbolize people. That sort of concept, you know, the 天时地利人和, again, it's a tripod relationship.
Yeah, it depends on how interpreted, and also for the situation, different situation, and we talk in different way. Yeah.
But you know, in usually in China, there's no way you can get away with 3 drinks, right? It's not possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Certainly don't stop after the 3rd drink.
Okay, thank you. I didn't drink wine. Usually we say we tell the truth after drinking wine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So
we talk frankly.
Some interesting cultural number that sort of exists in China and still and is still relevant to us today. Yeah. But it doesn't mean at all that we only drink 3 glasses of wine and we stop.
No. I understand. I see. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So, hi.
I went to on a wine tasting with some very good Chinese friends.
Yeah.
And when you have a tasting, often they talk about the nose.
Yeah.
Which is about, often it's brioche or black currants or plums. How do you relate those smells to China in terms of if you were doing a tasting in China for Chinese people?
That's a super interesting question. So I wrote an article about this because when I first started tasting wine, and they keep on telling me, oh, there's like cassis or gooseberry. And I was like, I have no idea what those fruits smell like. You know, it's just not the type of berries that grows, you know, in my back garden when I was growing up. So I really can't relate to them. And it's funny because when Chinese people are taught wine tasting, they are taught in those very traditional terms like, oh, Cabernet Sauvignon smells of cassis. And you're like, oh, what's that? You know, and Sauvignon Blanc is like gooseberry and that sort of thing. But increasingly, we're trying to encourage Chinese tasters to talk about smells and flavors that they're familiar with. So you'll notice people, even international wine critics, are starting to use terms like kumquat or hawthorn or you know, or pomelo, some cardamom, you know, that sort of thing. So I think the language of wine is now becoming more inclusive and expanding as more wine regions are and wine drinkers become, wine markets are becoming more important, you know. So you're starting to hear these type of words. And for example, one thing I had a discussion with someone. We talked about the tea and the relationship between tea and wine. And sometimes in wine, you get these notes of, for example, oolong tea. You know, oolong tea is sometimes a smell that could come across. For example, Chinese ice wine, what I love is a lot of Chinese ice wine have this beautiful aftertaste, a long aftertaste that has a strong oolong tea dimension to it, right? So it's interesting that you mentioned this because we are trying to introduce more of these vocabularies to how we describe wine. You know, we don't always have to be talking about cassis or gooseberries, you know, that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's a really good point.
Hello, Trevor.
Hi.
Yeah, that is a very good point because I did a tasting quite a few years ago in Beijing in 798, and actually it was on champagne. But the big thing was, like you said, when I told them about brioche and hot buttered toast, they hadn't got a clue what I was referring to because it's things that they don't eat or smell or have the aromas of. So you have to really start thinking of it in a totally different way. So yeah, it's very kind of interesting. You never thought about that till I actually did that tasting, and then that really yeah. So it's very interesting, that is. Yeah, but it's good that it's becoming more international so that people can understand it now. You know, even with all the people living in this country coming from China, Japan, and everywhere else, they want to understand those things.
Yeah. So you know, you see a lot of these, like people talk about yuzu, and you know, that sort of thing, and you would never see that in a tasting note, maybe 10 years ago. But yeah,
Yeah, and just one other point is that the Decanter Wine Awards, which were just out about 10 days ago, there was a few Chinese wines in there that were winning some of the awards. So
they are now starting to do fairly well consistently at international.
And I see that that ice wine won, I think, the overall best ice wine, which is Chinese ice wine, which so it's pretty amazing. That so well.
I think ice wine has a great potential in China. Yeah. We have the climate, we have the area, and it has good character and sensible prices as well. So pretty. Yeah.
You can say about Hugh.
How are you, Hugh and Jane? Are you with some other friends today? How are you, Hugh? It looks like the sound is switch on, but we cannot hear you.
We cannot hear you, Hugh.
Now I think we can hear now, right?
Can we hear you now, Hugh? Hello, Hugh?
Looks like you have some IT support there. I'm told that yesterday is Hugh and Jane's 44th wedding anniversary. Is that right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Anniversary and forever. Another 44 more years to come.
Can you hear us now? We can hear now. Brilliant.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary. Actually, Hugh, it's in all the small detail because I was amazed what a quick worker you was. Yeah, a very quick worker. You met in that year, moved in that year, got engaged and got married in that year. God, there's no messing around with you, is there, Hugh, eh?
Cheers, Bill.
Yes, all the best. Yeah. Many more of them to come, Hugh.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Many more years to come. Yeah.
So, that's good. Anyway, that was a very, very nice.
And how are you, Martin?
I'm good, thank you very much. How are you two? Are you good?
All right, yeah.
Good.
Starting to get into the Christmas mode.
Yeah.
Good. We can start go out to do shopping now.
Well, we haven't been because I think it looks a bit manic at the moment.
So we'll try to make
Emerson's favourite.
Yeah. So next session, I'll try to sit in front of a tree to add on some Christmas feeling.
Yeah, smart. It's good.
Okay, lovely seeing you. We still have some audience in the, although video, audio not on, but still there listening to all the chats. Thank you all very much for joining us again.
Yeah.
So next time, in 2 weeks' time, on the just before Christmas, 20th of December, same time, Sunday, 8 p.m., and we'll talk about festive season, sparkling wines. Okay?
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
See you, Jane.
Nice
to see you, Trev.
Cheers. Nice to see you, Trevor.
Bill. All the best.
Thank you, Donald.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
And you again. Yeah, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.